The blizzard came down out of the north in the last blue hour of the day like something with a grudge, and by full dark it had swallowed the whole of Black Pine Ridge, and Della Hartwell was somewhere in the heart of it, dying by inches, with all three of her children and no food and no fire and no notion left in her frozen head of which way was down the mountain and which way was deeper into thee. Killing White, she was 25 years old, 3 weeks a widow, and she had walked up into these mountains with her babies because staying down in Cedar Gap meant watching them starve slow in a cold rented room, and at least up here, she had told herself, there might be a trapper's cabin, a woodcutter, some soul with a fire and a scrap of bread and a Christian heart. And now the dark had come and the snow had come, and she understood with a terrible flat calm that she had gambled all 4 of their lives on a rumor of kindness and lost. The baby was against her chest inside her coat, wrapped in the last dry blanket, and Della could no longer feel whether the small weight of her was warm or cold. And she was afraid to stop and look because if she stopped, she did not think she would start again. Her boy Samuel walked at her side with his small, mittened hand fisted in her skirt, 4 years old, and gone silent an hour past, which frightened her more than crying would have. And little Pearl, who was but 2, rode on her hip on the other side from the baby, her wet face buried in her mother's neck, and she had stopped shivering. And Della knew enough of cold to know that a child who has stopped shivering is a child the cold has nearly finished with, and it was that knowledge, more than anything, that kept her stumbling forward through drifts to her knees when every other part of her only wanted to lie down in the soft white and rest. Just a little more, she said to the children, to herself, to God, her cracked lips barely moving. Just a little more. There's a light. I saw a light. She had seen a light. She was almost sure she had seen a light, a while back, before the snow closed in a small gold square far off through the trees, and she had fixed the memory of it in her mind like a nail to hang her life on. And she staggered toward where she believed it had been, and there was nothing there but more black pines and more white snow, and the wind screaming down off the peaks like the voice of the mountain itself telling her to give it up. Give it up. Lie down and give it up. And then, through a gap in the storm, she saw it again. The light, real and gold and close, a window, a cabin, low and dark and half buried in snow with smoke torn sideways off its chimney, not 50 yards on. Della made a sound that was not quite a word. She turned toward it with the last of everything she had, and she fell. And she got up, and she fell again with Pearl clutched to her. And she crawled the final stretch on her knees through the drifts to the cabin door, and she pulled herself up against the rough timber of it, and she raised one frozen fist that she could barely feel, and she pounded on the door, and she pounded again. And she cried out in a voice with nothing left in it, "Please, please, in the name of God, open the door. I have children, please." For a long moment there was nothing but the wind, and then the door was flung open, and warmth and firelight fell out into the blizzard like something spilled, and standing in the golden gap of it, filling it, was the biggest man Della had ever seen. He was huge, shoulders near as wide as the door, with a shaggy dark beard and shaggy dark hair and heavy black brows drawn down over deep-set eyes. And in the wild fire-lit dark of that moment, he looked to her frozen mind like something out of the old stories. A mountain troll, a bear stood up on its hind legs, and Della's exhausted heart quailed, and she thought, I have carried them all this way to die on a monster's doorstep. But she had no strength left to run, and nowhere to run to. And so she only stood swaying in the snow with the baby against her chest and Pearl on her hip and Samuel pressed into her side, and she looked up at the giant in the doorway, and She said the only thing she had left to say. "Not for me," she whispered. "I don't care for me. But the children, please, the children." And she watched the terrible dark face change. Whatever the man had expected when he opened his door against a blizzard at that black hour, it had not been this: a half-frozen woman on her knees with 3 small children and death an arm's length behind her. She saw his eyes go from her ruined face to the small snow-cake shapes of the little ones to the swaddled bundle clutched to her breast, and she saw something move behind that fearsome beard that she had no name for, and then the giant was not fearsome at all. He dropped to a crouch that brought his great face level with hers, and when he spoke his voice was a low, rough rumble, but gentle, unbearably gentle, the way you might speak to a spooked horse. "Give me the baby," he said. Della's arms tightened on instinct. "I'll not harm her," the man said, "but she needs to be by the fire this minute, and so do the rest of you, and you're too far gone to carry her the last of the way. Give me the baby, missus. I've got you now. You're not going to die tonight, not one of you, not on my mountain." And he held out 2 enormous hands, and there was snow in his beard and the storm at his back, and Della Hartwell, who had held on to everything alone for 3 weeks and for the whole of her hard life before that, looked into the steel blue eyes of a stranger and did the hardest thing she had done all that terrible night. She let go. She placed her sleeping baby into the giant's hands, and the moment the weight left her, she felt herself begin to fall, and the man caught her too. Caught the whole exhausted breaking weight of her against his chest with the baby cradled safe in the crook of one arm, and he gathered Pearl up in the other, and he said over his shoulder in that rough rumble, "Boy, take hold of my coat and don't let go." And Samuel fisted his little hand in the fur of the giant's coat, and the mountain man carried Della's whole family in out of the storm and kicked the door shut on the screaming wind. His name was Gideon Rourke, though it would be some while before Della learned it, and he had lived alone on Black Pine Ridge for the better part of 9 years, and in all that time not one soul had knocked on his door. What Della remembered after of that first hour came in pieces, for she was farther gone than she knew. She remembered being set down in a great chair before a roaring stone hearth, and the pain of the warmth coming into her frozen hands being worse almost than the cold had been. She remembered the man moving about the small cabin with a swiftness surprising in someone so large, building the fire higher, stripping the wet frozen wraps off the children with a woodsman's quick, careful hands, rubbing their small blue feet between his enormous palms to bring the blood back. She remembered him warming milk in a pan over the fire. He had a goat, she would learn, in a lean-to off the back, a thing near miraculous in that country in winter, and she remembered him feeding it to the baby drop by patient, drop off the tip of his little finger when the infant was too weak to suck. This huge rough man hunched over her tiny daughter with a concentration fierce as prayer. She remembered a big old brown and black hound with a graying muzzle who came and lay down its whole warm length against the shivering children as though it had been told to, and perhaps it had. And she remembered, last of all, the man crouching before her and holding a tin cup of something hot to her cracked lips and saying, "Drink, missus, all of it." There's more, and she remembered drinking. And then she remembered nothing at all, for her body, understanding at last that it was safe, finally let her go under. She woke to gray daylight and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, and for one blank moment she did not know where she was. And then she came up out of the chair with her heart slamming, reaching, counting. Where were they? Where were the children? And the big man's voice came quiet from across the room. "They're here. All 3. Sleeping? Look." And she looked, And there, on a wide bunk built against the warm chimney wall, buried in furs and quilts, were her 3 babies, pink-cheeked and living and deep asleep, the baby tucked between her brother and sister with the old hound curled at their feet, and Della put her face in her hands and wept, and this time it was not from grief. "They're strong," Gideon said from the fire, awkward before a weeping woman, not looking at her, stirring a pot. The little ones came around quick once they were warm. The baby's the one had me worried in the night, but she took the milk near dawn and slept sound after, and her color's good now. Children are tougher than folk credit, it's a mercy. He ladled something into a bowl, a thick porridge of cornmeal and dried apple, and brought it to her without meeting her eyes and put it in her hands. "Eat slow. You've been starving a while, I can tell, and a starving body can't take much at once." Slow and small. Della ate slow and small, and watched the great gentle giant move about his cabin, and when she could speak, she said, "I don't know how to thank you. There aren't words that are big enough. We would have died. All of us. We would be dead in the snow right now if you hadn't," her voice broke. "Then don't say it," Gideon said, gruff. "You'd have done the same. Most wouldn't." He was quiet a moment. "No," he agreed at last, low, "most wouldn't. I've cause to know it." And he did not explain that, not then, but Della saw a shadow cross his weathered face, and she understood that she was not the only one in that warm cabin who had been left out in the cold by the world once. The storm blew itself out over the next 2 days, and then set in a second time, and the mountain kept them snowed in on Black Pine Ridge for the better part of a fortnight, and in that fortnight a strange and unlooked-for thing happened in Gideon Rourke's cabin, which was that it became a home. Della, her strength returning, could not abide idleness and would not be a burden, and so she cooked and mended and scrubbed and set the rough bachelor cabin to rights, and Gideon, who had forgotten what a woman's care could make of a room, came in from the cold each evening to warmth and light and the smell of bread, and did not seem to know what to do with the ache it put in his chest. The children mended fastest of all, as children do. Little Pearl, who had been so near lost, was soon toddling after the old hound Duke on fat, unsteady legs and shrieking with laughter. And Samuel, grave, silent Samuel, attached himself to Gideon the way iron attaches to a lodestone, following the big man about the cabin, watching him whittle and mend traps and split kindling with his solemn dark eyes, saying nothing, simply needing to be near him, and Gideon, who was clumsy and unsure with the woman and the baby, was easy with the boy in a way that told Della he had known how to be a father once, long ago, before whatever had happened to him happened. There was one bad night in the middle of that fortnight that bound them together more than all the quiet days. The baby took a turn near midnight, went hot and fretful and would not take the milk, and began a thin, exhausted crying that Della knew too well, the cry of a child whose small body has been pushed too near the edge and is paying the cost of it now. Della walked the floor with her for an hour, and then 2, her own face gray with the old helpless terror, and Gideon did not go to his bed. He built the fire up and set stones to warm at its edge, and wrapped them in flannel to tuck about the infant, and he brewed a bitter tea of dried willow bark and pine needle that his own mother had used, he said low, on him and his brothers when they were small, and he coaxed it into the baby drop by drop off a spoon while Della held her, the 2 of them bent together over the tiny struggling thing in the firelight through the blackest hours of the night, saying little, needing to say little. Toward dawn the fever broke. The baby sighed and went slack and slept, her small brow gone cool and damp under Della's palm, and Della looked up across the sleeping child at the big man's exhausted face, and something passed between them in that gray first light that was deeper than anything words could have carried. The particular closeness of two people who have sat up together through a long night, fighting the same darkness for the same small life. "She'll do now," Gideon said hoarsely. "She'll do." And Della found she could not answer him for the fullness in her throat, and he seemed to understand that too, and only reached out and, very gently, with one enormous rough finger, touched the sleeping baby's cheek, and then, after a moment's hesitation, the back of Della's tired hand where it cradled the child, and left it there. And neither of them moved away. She learned his griefs the way you learn anything true from a quiet man, slowly, sideways, in the low hours by the fire when the children slept. His wife, he told her one night, near 9 years gone. And a daughter. A cabin down in the valley, not this one. This one he'd built after, up high, away from everything. There had been a sickness one winter, a fever, and he had ridden 4 days through snow to fetch a doctor from the fort, and he had come back with the doctor to find both of them already in the ground, buried by neighbors who could not wait, and he had never forgiven the world for going on turning, nor himself for not being there, and he had come up onto the ridge to be alone with it, and had stayed 9 years. "I stopped looking for the good in folk," he said, staring into the fire. "Decided there wasn't much, and what there was, the cold took anyhow. Told myself I liked being shut of the whole business." He was silent a while. Then a fool woman knocks on my door in the worst blow of the year, with 3 babes, and won't even beg for her own life, only theirs. He shook his shaggy head slowly. 9 years I kept everybody out. Turns out all it took was a locked door and a bad enough storm to make me open it. "I'm sorry," Della said softly, "for what you lost." "I'm not sorry," Gideon said, "for what walked in." And then he seemed startled at himself, and got up gruffly to see to the fire, and neither of them said anything more that night, but something had been spoken all the same, and they both knew it. The boy gave up his silence to Gideon before he gave it to anyone. Samuel had scarce spoken a word since his father died, had gone locked and quiet in the way of a child who has learned that speaking of a hurt only makes it real, and Della had near given up hope of hearing his voice again. But one afternoon she came in from milking the goat to find the boy sitting on an upturned bucket at Gideon's knee, while the big man mended a snowshoe, and Samuel was talking, low and halting, but talking, asking what the sinew was, and where the wood came from, and whether a bear could break a snowshoe, and Gideon answering each question grave and full as though it were the most important question a man had ever been asked, never once letting on that a miracle was taking place on that bucket. Della froze in the doorway with the milk pail in her hand and did not dare to move or speak for fear of breaking it. Later, when the boy had run off to torment the dog, Gideon said without looking up from his work, "He asked me today would I teach him to set a trap line. Come, he's bigger." He was quiet a moment. I said I would. I hoped that was right. I didn't like to promise him a thing and then not be here to. He stopped. Della crossed the room and stood before him. "You'll be here," she said. It was not a question, and it was the nearest either of them had yet come to saying the thing that was growing between them, and Gideon looked up at her from under his heavy brows, and slowly, for the first time since she had known him. The big man smiled, and it changed his whole dark face like sun coming over a ridge. Della's own tale she told him too. Her Thomas dead 3 weeks when she'd walked up the mountain, a good man, a hopeful man, too hopeful, who had sunk everything they had into a mining claim up the gulch that had never yielded a thing but false promise, and who had gone out in the first storm of the season to work it anyway because winter was coming and they had nothing, and been caught by a rockfall in the dark and not come home. She'd buried him on credit she couldn't pay. The claim was worthless and mortgaged besides. The room in Cedar Gap she couldn't afford past the week. And no kin in 1,000 miles, and a town that looked at a penniless widow with 3 babes as a problem to be moved along rather than a family to be helped. So I went looking for the edge of the map, she said. For somewhere the rules were different. I didn't have a plan, God help me. I just couldn't sit in that cold room and watch them fade. I had to try something, even a mad thing. She looked at her sleeping children. It was the maddest thing I ever did walking into these mountains, and it saved their lives. I'll never understand it as long as I live. Some doors, Gideon said, you only find because you were desperate enough to go where no sensible soul would. The mountain tested them once more before it let them be. On a still bitter night near the end of the second storm, the goat began to scream in the lean-to, and the old hound, Duke, came off the children's bunk with every hair on his spine standing up and a growl in him like tearing canvas, and Gideon was up and had the rifle down off its pegs before Della had rightly woken. "Wolves," he said low, pulling on his coat. The deep cold drove them down off the high country desperate, and the smell of the goat and the wood smoke had drawn them in. He looked at Della in the firelight. "Bar the door behind me and don't open it for anything but my voice." And he went out into the black cold with the dog, and Della heard the goat screaming and the wolves snarling, and then the flat crack of the rifle once and twice. And then a long silence that stopped her heart, and then, blessedly, Gideon's voice at the door, and she threw the bar back, and he came in stamping and bleeding from a torn forearm where a wolf had caught him, and the goat was saved, and 2 wolves were dead in the snow. And now it was Della's turn. She sat the great man down in the firelight, and she cleaned the wound with hot water, and she stitched the worst of it closed with a needle and waxed thread from her mending kit. Her hand steady, though her heart was not, and Gideon watched her work with a queer, wondering look on his face, and when she had bound it clean he said, "My wife," and stopped himself, gone red, and started again. Clara, she'd faint at the sight of blood. Not a fault in her, only she was a gentle raised thing. You never so much as flinched. "I've patched my Thomas up more times than I can count," Della said, tying off the bandage. "A mining man's wife learns to." She smoothed the binding and did not take her hands away. "We're neither of us gentle raised things, Gideon Rourke. Maybe that's no bad match." And the big man looked at her a long moment in the firelight, his wounded arm in her steady hands and his 3 near children asleep in the warm dark behind them. And something in him seemed to settle for good and all, though he said nothing, for he was a man who mostly didn't. It could not last, of course, the snowed in peace of it, and Della knew it could not, and dreaded the knowing. And sure enough, when the second storm cleared, and the sky came up hard and brilliant blue, and the passes opened, the world came looking for them. It came in the shape of a fine black sleigh, climbing the ridge trail 2 weeks to the day after Della had crawled to the cabin door. And in the sleigh sat a prim stout man in a fur-collared overcoat and small round spectacles, with a leather document case on his knees, and Della's stomach turned to ice the moment she saw him through the window. For she knew the look of officialdom, and she knew it never climbed a mountain and wintered to bring good news. His name was Horace Bell, and he was the poor relief officer for the county, and he had come. he explained in a dry, pleased voice once Gideon had grudgingly let him stand dripping by the fire on a matter concerning the Hartwell children. Word had reached Cedar Gap, he said, of a destitute widow gone missing into the mountains with 3 minor children. An inquiry had been made, and now here she was, discovered residing, most irregularly, in the cabin of an unmarried man, in circumstances he could only call unwholesome. The county, he said, had a duty. A destitute widow with no means, no husband, no property, and no prospects was not a fit guardian for 3 small children, however dear. He had here the papers. The children were to be taken into the care of the Territorial Orphan Asylum in Denver, where they would be clothed and fed and, in time, placed out to suitable families, separately, most like, given their ages, the babe being adoptable and the boy old enough to be bound out to labor. No, Della said. She had risen. She was shaking. No, you will not take my children. You will not, separately, you will not, madam, be reasonable. The law is not cruel, it is practical. A woman in your circumstances simply cannot, her circumstances, said Gideon Rourke, have changed. He had been standing silent by the door through all of it, so still and so dark that Belle had near forgotten him, and now he came forward into the firelight, and he seemed to fill the whole cabin, and the poor relief officer took an involuntary step back. Gideon looked down at the small prim man for a long moment, and then he said, in that low, rough rumble, every word set down slow and heavy as stones, "This woman is going to be my wife. These children are going to be mine. This cabin, and the 200 acres it sits on, and the stock and the trap lines and the money I've got laid by in 9 years of spending near nothing, all of it's theirs now. And there's no orphan asylum in the territory going to take a fed, housed, wanted child from a home with a father and a mother and a roof and food enough. You want to talk about fitness, Mr. Bell? You climbed a mountain in the snow to break up 4 people who between them haven't got a soul else in the world, and call it duty. I climbed out of a grave I'd been lying in 9 years to keep them together, and I call it the first sensible thing I've done in all that time. Now you can write on your papers that the Hartwell children reside with their mother and their stepfather, Gideon Rourke of Black Pine Ridge, in good health and better care than the county ever gave a soul. Or you can argue it with me. But you'll not do the second thing standing up. He opened the cabin door onto the blazing cold blue day. Your sleigh's waiting. Horace Bell looked up at the giant, and at the warm cabin, and at the 3 healthy children peering wide-eyed from the bunk, and at the woman standing fierce as a she-wolf before them. And he was a bureaucrat and not a fool. And he gathered his document case and his dignity, and allowed as how, in light of the changed circumstances, and provided a record of marriage were furnished to the county in due course, the matter might be considered closed. And he climbed back into his fine black sleigh and drove down off the ridge, and Della watched him dwindle against the snow until he was gone. And then she turned very slowly to look at the man who had just, without asking her, without warning her, without so much as glancing her way, given her and her children his name, his land, and everything he owned. You needn't, she began, her voice unsteady. You said that to be rid of him. I understand. You needn't hold to it. I'd not trap you, Gideon, not for anything, not after all you've, Della. It was the first time he had said her given name, and it stopped her. He crossed the cabin to her, this huge, gentle, shaggy man, and he stood before her, turning his shapeless felt hat around and around in his enormous hands like a bashful boy, and his weathered face was ruddy above the beard. And he could not quite meet her eyes. I didn't say it to be rid of him, he said. I said it because it's what I want. I've wanted it near since the night you knocked, only I hadn't the courage nor the right to say it. And that little weasel forced my hand, and I'm glad he did, for I might have kept my mouth shut another 9 years otherwise." He drew a breath. "I'm too old for you, and too rough, and I live too far from anywhere, and I come with more grief than any woman ought to take on. But I'll be good to you, and I'll be a father to those children till the day I die. And I'll spend every last thing I've got and every breath in my body keeping the 4 of you warm and fed and safe, and I'll never once, so long as I live, let any door be shut against you again. That's all I've got to offer. It's yours if you'll have it, and if you won't, you'll have it anyway, the cabin and the keeping of it, and I'll build myself another up the ridge and trouble you none. But I'm asking, Della Hartwell, will you have me?" And Della, who 3 weeks before had knelt weeping in a blizzard begging a stranger to save her babies and not herself, looked up at that stranger's kind, fierce face and understood that the mountain she had climbed in her madness and despair had led her, by a road no sane soul would ever have chosen, to the one warm door in all the wide, cold world that would open to her and never close. She thought of Samuel following him about the cabin. She thought of Pearl asleep against his chest. She thought of him feeding her dying baby milk off his fingertip in the black hours of the night, a man who owed them nothing, who had every reason to have turned 4 freezing strangers back into the storm, and who had instead caught her whole falling family in his arms and said, "You're not going to die tonight, not on my mountain." "Gideon Rourke," she said, and she was smiling and weeping both at once. "I knocked on a great many doors in my life that never opened. I think I'll keep the one that did." They were wed in Cedar Gap when spring opened the passes, in the little clapboard church, with the children scrubbed and shining in new clothes and the old hound Duke waiting disgraced but dignified on the church steps. And if the good people of the town who had once looked at a penniless widow as a problem to be moved along, now looked at the wife of Gideon Rourke of Black Pine Ridge with considerable new respect, Della found she could forgive them. For she had learned that winter that the measure of a soul is not taken in its easy seasons, but in whether it will open the door when the storm is worst, and a stranger is dying on the step. Samuel stood up beside Gideon and did not lose the ring. Pearl scattered crushed, dried petals down the aisle and ate several. And the baby, little June they had named her, for the summer they none of them had been sure they would live to see, slept through the whole of it in the great gentle arms of the man who had saved her life. The man she would grow up calling Papa and never know had not always been so. And in the long years after, when the cabin on the ridge had been added on to twice over to hold the growing family, and the trap lines had given way to a good herd and a fine barn, and Black Pine Ridge was no longer a hermit's lonely exile, but the warmest and most crowded and most laughed in home on all that stretch of mountain, Della would sometimes wake in the deep of a winter night to the sound of a blizzard howling against the eaves, the same wild, killing wind that had so nearly ended them all, and she would lie warm in the dark beside her sleeping husband, with her children safe under the same good roof, and she would listen to the storm rage itself out against the walls of the home that love had built, and she would think how close a thing it had been, and how strange and how merciful that the worst night of her life, the night she was certain was the end of everything, had turned out instead to be the door. She had knocked in despair, asking only that her children be spared. And the mountain had answered with a whole life. There is no measuring such a thing. She never tried. She only held it, every day of her days, the way you hold a fire you have carried a long, cold way, and finally set down safe in a warm hearth to blaze.